In the 1600s, the island at the mouth of the Hudson shifted like a frontier wind, a place where the map was still being drawn in blood and ink. It began as a modest Dutch trading post called New Amsterdam, a precarious cluster of wooden roofs clinging to the edge of a vast, unknown wilderness. It ended the century as New York, a coveted prize for rival empires and a crossroads of ambition on the edge of a continent. Between these two names lies a century of sweat, smoke, and transformation. This was not yet the city of steel and glass, but a raw, muddy settlement where the scent of beaver pelts mingled with the salt air of the Atlantic. It was a place where fortunes were made in the shadows of primeval forests, and where the language of the streets shifted from the guttural rhythms of Dutch to the sharp commands of English. This is the story of a city born from the water, forged in the struggle between nations, and destined to become the capital of the world. In 1609, the silence of the harbor was broken by the creak of rigging and the snap of canvas. Henry Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, drifted into the wide, calm waters of the river that would one day bear his name. His crew, weary from the Atlantic crossing, stepped onto a wooded tidal shore that was alive with the ancient rhythms of the Lenape people. To the Europeans, it was a discovery. To the Lenape, it was an invasion masked as trade. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth, the forests teeming with game, the waters boiling with fish. It was a quiet moment, unadorned and uncertain, but it opened the door to everything that followed. Hudson's arrival marked the first European foothold in a land that would soon be carved up by merchants, settlers, and competing crowns. The river was no longer just a flow of water. It was a vein of gold, a highway into the fur-rich interior that would drive the economy of the coming colony. By 1626, the Dutch West India Company had moved to secure this prize. In a deal that history has debated and mythologized, Dutch officials purchased Manhattan from the Lenape. The ledger recorded a value of 60 guilders worth of trade goods, axes, kettles, and cloth. It was a transaction deeply misunderstood across the cultural divide. The Dutch believed they were buying land ownership. The Lenape believed they were sharing land use rights, a concept of stewardship rather than possession. Yet, on paper in Amsterdam, the deal was done. The Dutch had their foothold, and they quickly moved to fortify it. But a deed was not a city. In the early days of New Amsterdam, building the settlement meant relentless, back-breaking labor. This was a battle against nature itself. Settlers felled the thick, ancient oaks and hickories of Manhattan with hand axes, their palms blistering as they dragged heavy logs through the deep mud to raise the first homes, palisades, and warehouses. The air was permanently filled with wood smoke, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the sharp crack of splitting timber. The colony carved itself out of the wilderness, one beam, one plank, one hard-earned day at a time. It was a fragile existence where a harsh winter or a failed crop could mean the end of the enterprise. To protect this fragile investment, Fort Amsterdam rose at the southern tip of the island in 1626. It was a rough, four-pointed star of earth and timber, a statement of intent guarding the harbor's shifting tides. From its ramparts, soldiers in buff coats and steel helmets watched the horizon, their eyes scanning for Spanish raiders or English privateers. The fort was the colony's shield and its heart. Inside its walls lay the warehouses of the company, filled with the furs that paid for the settlement's existence. It was a military outpost pretending to be a town, a place where the governor's word was law and the company's profit was God. But peace was elusive. By 1644, the relationship with the indigenous nations had fractured into violence. Kieft's War had left the colony bleeding and fearful. Dutch leaders and native sachems eventually forged a series of fragile treaties meant to quiet years of bloodshed. Around council fires and makeshift tables in the fort, envoys traded wampum promises and uneasy concessions. The agreements brought a brief, hard-won peace, less a bond of trust than a pause born of mutual exhaustion. Yet these paper shields allowed New Amsterdam to breathe, to rebuild, and to turn its gaze back to the sea. As the colony expanded, its labor force changed. In 1655, the face of the city began to darken with a new and tragic reality. Enslaved Africans were brought into New Amsterdam in growing numbers, their forced labor woven into the very foundations of the colony. They were not immigrants seeking a new life. They were property, sold by the Dutch West India Company to work the docks, the farms, and the households of the wealthy. They cleared the land that would become the Bowery, they built the roads, and they loaded the ships. Under harsh rules and constant supervision, they lived a life of bondage in a land that promised freedom to others. It was a quiet but brutal turning point, the moment when slavery became a fixed, indispensable part of the city's early economy, a sin that would stain its history for centuries to come. Inside a New Amsterdam home in the mid-17th century, life unfolded in a single crowded room, warmed by a cavernous brick hearth. The light filtered through small leaded windows, falling across rough-hewn tables, piles of wool blankets, and pewter dishes stacked neatly on shelves. This was a world of domestic industry. Families rose before the sun to the smell of grain porridge and the scrape of wooden stools against the floorboards. Children, miniature adults in their dress and duties, helped grind corn or fetch water from the communal pumps, while adults tended to the endless chores of survival. Men mended nets and cut firewood. Women salted meats for the long winter and spun wool. The air inside these homes carried a distinct mix of aromas: burning hickory, drying herbs, pipe tobacco, and the damp, briny scent of the river winds slipping through the cracks in the walls. Evenings were quiet but full, the darkness held back by tallow candles guttering low. Stories were told in low Dutch dialects, prayers were whispered, and tools were laid out for the morning's work. Life was modest, disciplined, and communal. Every task, cooking, sewing, sweeping, tending livestock that roamed the muddy streets, held the steady rhythm of survival in a growing but still fragile settlement. But the geopolitical winds were shifting. The English, envious of the Dutch wedge driving their northern and southern colonies apart, cast covetous eyes on Manhattan. In 1664, the inevitable arrived. 4 English warships drifted into the harbor, their guns trained on the crumbling walls of Fort Amsterdam. The city was unprepared. Its gunpowder was wet, its walls were weak, and its people were tired. Director General Peter Stuyvesant, the peg-legged autocrat who had ruled with an iron fist, stomped on the ramparts and demanded resistance. He wanted to fight to the last man. But the merchants and citizens of New Amsterdam saw only ruin in resistance. Outnumbered and divided, they petitioned Stuyvesant to surrender. With a heavy heart and a quiet fury, the old soldier relented. New Amsterdam offered no fire. With a quiet surrender, the flags were changed. The Dutch tricolor came down, the Union Jack went up, and the city gained a new name, New York, in honor of the Duke of York. Its future was redirected without a single shot fired. The Dutch colony absorbed into the growing English empire like a drop of water in the sea. Diplomacy soon ratified what force had achieved. In 1667, the Treaty of Breda formally sealed the transfer. The Dutch ceded New Netherland to England in exchange for the sugar-rich colony of Suriname in South America. At the time, it seemed like a shrewd trade for the Dutch. Sugar was gold, while Manhattan was just a fur trading post. But history would prove otherwise. The agreement confirmed New York as English territory, ending Dutch hopes of reclaiming the colony. With a stroke of a quill on parchment, the city's new identity, its laws, its loyalties, and its future became fixed on the English side of history. Yet the Dutch spirit was stubborn. In 1673, during another flare-up of war, a Dutch fleet swept into the harbor and reclaimed the city with sudden, overwhelming force. For a single restless year, New York became New Orange. Old banners were unfurled, and the Dutch language returned to the courts. But diplomacy moved faster than cannons. By the next treaty in 1674, the colony was returned to England for good. New Orange once again became New York. The moment was brief, a final flicker of the old Dutch world before the English future closed firmly around it. By 1679, the transition was physical as well as political. The old Dutch Stadhuis served as New York City Hall, a stone remnant of New Amsterdam now beating under English rule. Merchants, magistrates, and clerks moved through its cramped rooms, settling disputes and recording the business of a growing cosmopolitan port. The building stood as a visual reminder of the city's layered past. Dutch bones with an English skin. It was still useful, still central, even as New York pushed into its new identity. The population was booming, topping 4,000 souls by 1680. New brick houses rose along the winding streets, their facades reflecting the changing tastes. The old steep Dutch gables were slowly joined by English sash windows and broader chimneys, creating a unique architectural hybrid. The streets, however, remained stubbornly Dutch in their winding, organic shape, a map of the past beneath the feet of the present. The heartbeat of this new city was the Great Dock. By 1679, it stretched into the East River, the colony's busiest gateway and the engine of its wealth. Merchants, sailors, and stevedores crowded its wet planks, a polyglot mob speaking a dozen languages. They unloaded barrels of molasses, sugar, and rum from the Caribbean, furs from the interior, and tobacco from Virginia, while loading flour and timber for Europe. The air here was thick with the smell of tar, spices, and rotting fish. The dock's constant creak and roar signaled the city's growing ambitions. This was no longer just a trading post. It was becoming a vital link in the Atlantic world, a pivot point around which the empire's trade revolved. New York was becoming a city of merchants, where rank was determined not just by birth, but by the ledger book. Yet, fear remained a constant companion. The old defensive wall still marked the northern edge of the settlement, running along the line that would become Wall Street. Its timber ramparts were aging, the wood gray and weathering, but they were kept intact. Where the wall met the East River stood the Water Gate, a modest, fortified passage where carts, travelers, and river goods entered the town under watchful guard. It was a physical boundary between civilization and the wild, between the safety of the city and the unknown dangers of the hinterland. In 1689, that sense of order shattered from within. The Glorious Revolution in England sent shockwaves across the ocean. News of kings rising and falling left the colony unsure whose authority truly ruled. In the vacuum of power, New York's train band, the citizen militia, mustered amid the unrest. Merchants, artisans, and laborers drilled on the commons, their breath steaming in the cold air. Class tensions and ethnic divides boiled over into Leisler's rebellion. Jacob Leisler, a German merchant, seized control of the fort, claiming to hold it for the new Protestant monarchs. For months, the city was torn apart. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion. The rebellion was a mix of Dutch resentment against English elite rule and a cry from the common man. But it proved brief. When the royal governor finally arrived, Leisler was arrested, tried, and hanged. For all their moment of resolve, the rebels ended the year once again under royal authority, their bodies buried, but the spirit of defiance lingering in the city's soil. By the close of the century, New York was tense, unsettled, but undeniably alive. It lived in a state of uneasy waiting, caught between rumor, uncertainty, and the shifting tide of empire. By 1699, the transformation was undeniable. Pearl Street had become one of New York's busiest lanes, curving along the old shoreline where the water lapped against the bulkheads. Traders, craftsmen, and sailors crowded its wooden shops, turning the street into a vibrant bazaar. The scent of tar, spices from the Indies, and the fresh river wind drifted through the street, a constant reminder of how close the city lived to the sea that sustained it. The wooden palisades of the early days were giving way to brick and stone. The forests that Hudson saw were gone, replaced by wharves and warehouses. New York stood on the precipice of a new century, no longer a fragile outpost, but a city with a destiny. It was a place of hard bargains and sharp elbows. A city that had learned to survive invasion, rebellion, and fire. As the sun set on the 1600s, the lights of New York reflected in the dark waters of the harbor, signaling to the world that on this island, something immense was beginning.